Chapter 4. Over Hill and Under Hill. There were many paths that led up those mountains, and many passes over them. But most of the paths were cheats and deceptions and led nowhere, or to the bad ends. And most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. The dwarves and the Hobbit, helped by the wise advice of Elrond and the knowledge of memory of Gandalf, took the right road to the right pass. Long days after they had climbed out of the valley and left the last homely house miles behind, they were still going up and up and up. It was a hard path and a dangerous path, a crooked way and lonely and long. Now they could look back over the lands that they had left, laid out behind them far below. Far, far away in the west, where things were blue and faint. Bilbo knew there lay down his own country of safe and comfortable things, and his little hobbit hole. He shivered. It was getting a bitter cold up here, and the winds came shrill among the mountains. Rocks, boulders, too, at times came galloping down the mountain sides, let loose by mid-Sunday down the snow and passed among them, which was lucky, or over their heads, which was alarming. The nights were comfortless and chill, and they did not dare to sing or talk too loud, for the echoes were uncanny, and the silence seemed to dislike being broken, except by the noise of water, and the wail of wind, and the crack of stone. "The summer is getting on down below," thought Bilbo, "and haymaking going on and picnics. We'll be harvesting and blackberrying before we even begin to go down the other side at this rate." And the others were thinking equally glooming thoughts, although when they had said goodbye to Elrond in the high hope of the midsummer morning, they had spoken gaily in the passage of the mountains and of riding swift across the lands beyond. They had thought of coming to the secret door in the lovely mountain, perhaps that very next first moon of autumn. "And perhaps it will be Durin's Day," they had said, only Gandalf had shaken his head and said nothing. Dwarves have not passed that way for many years, but Gandalf had, and he knew how evil and danger had grown from the thriven in the wild, since the dragons had driven men from the lands, and the goblins had spread in the secret after the battle in the mines of Moria. Even the good plains of wide wizards like Gandalf and of good friends like Elrond go astray sometimes when you are off on dangerous adventures over the edge of the wild. And Gandalf was wise enough, wizard, to know it. He knew that something unexpected might happen, and he hardly dared to hope that they would pass without fearful adventure over those great tall mountains with lonely peaks and valleys where no king ruled. They did not. All was well until one day they met a thunderstorm. More than a thunderstorm, it was a thunder battle. You know how terrific a really big thunderstorm can be down in the land and in the river valley, especially at times when two great thunderstorms meet and clash. More terrible still are the thunder and lightning in the mountains at night, when storm comes up from the east and west and make war. The lightning splinters on the peaks, and rocks shiver. The great crashes split the air and go rolling and tumbling in every cave and hollow, and the darkness is filled with overwhelming noise and sudden light. Bilbo has never seen or imagined anything of the kind. They were high up in the narrow place, with the dreadful fall and the dim valley in one side of them. They were sheltering under a hanging rock for the night, and he lay beneath a blanket and shook from head to toe. When he peeped out in the lightning flashes, he saw that across the valley the stone giants were out, and were hurling rocks at one another for game, and catching them, and tossing them down in the darkness where they smashed upon the trees below, or splintering into little bits with a bang. Then came a wind and a rain, and the wind whipped the rain and the hail about in every direction, so that an overhanging rock was no protection at all. Soon they were getting drenched, and their ponies were standing with their heads down and their tails between their legs, and some of them were whining in fright. They could hear the giant guffawing and shouting over the mountainsides. "This won't do at all," said Thorn. "If we don't get blown off or drowned or struck by lightning, we shall be picked up by some giant and kicked sky-high in a football." "Well, if you know anywhere better, take us there," said Gandalf, who was feeling very grumpy and was far from happy about the giants himself. The end of their argument was that they sent Fili and Kili to look for better shelter. They had very sharp eyes, and being the youngest of the dwarves were some 50 years, they got their sort of jobs where everyone could see that they were absolutely no use sending Bilbo. There's nothing like looking if you want to find something, or so Thorin said to the young dwarves. You certainly usually find something if you were to look, but it is not always quite the something you were after, so it had proven on this occasion. Soon Fili and Kili came crawling back, holding on to the rocks in the wind. "We have found a dry cave," they said, "not far around the next corner. Ponies and all could get inside." "Have you thoroughly explored it?" said the wizard. They knew the caves up in the mountains were seldom unoccupied. Yes, yes, they said, though everybody knew they could not have been long about it. They had come back too quick. It isn't all that big, and it doesn't go far back. That, of course, is the dangerous part about caves. You don't know how far they go back, sometimes, or where a passage behind may lead to is what is waiting for you on the inside. But now Fili and Kili's news seemed good enough, so they all got up and prepared to move. The wind was howling and the thunder still growling, and they had a business getting themselves to their ponies along. Still, it was not far to go, and before long they came to a big rock standing out in the path. If you stepped behind, you found a low arch in the side of the mountain. There was just enough room to get these ponies through with a squeeze when they had been unpacked and unsaddled, and they passed under the arch. It was good to hear that the wind and the rain outside instead of all about them, and to feel safe from the giants and their rocks. But the wizard was taking no risks. He lit up his wand, as he did the day at the Bilbo dining room that seemed so long ago, if you remember, and by his light they explored the cave from end to end. It seemed quite a fair size, but not too large and mysterious. He had a dry floor and some comfortable nooks. At one end there was a room for the ponies, and there they stood, mighty glad of the change, steaming and champing in their nose bags. Oin and Cloyne wanted to light a fire at the door to dry their clothes, but Gandalf would not hear of it. So they spread out their wet things on the floor and got comfortable, got out their pipes and blew smoke rings, which Gandalf turned into different colors and set dancing upon the roof to amuse them. They talked and forgot about the storm, and discussed what each would do with their share of the treasure when they got it, which, at the moment, did not seem so impossible. And so they dropped off to sleep one by one, and that was the last time they used their ponies, or packages, baggages, tools, and paraphernalia that they brought with them. It turned out to be a good thing that night they had somehow brought that little Bilbo with them after all, for somehow he could not go to sleep for a long while. And when he did sleep, he had very nasty dreams. He dreamed that a crack in the wall at the back of the cave got bigger and bigger and opened wider and wider, and he was very afraid but could not call out or do anything but lie and look. Then he dreamed that the floor of the cave was giving way and he was slipping, beginning to fall down, goodness knows where to. And that he woke up with a horrible start and found that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened in the back of the cave and was already a wide passage. He was just in time to see the last of the pony's tail disappearing into it. Of course, he gave a very loud as loud as a yell as a hobbit could give, which is surprising for their size. Out jumped the goblins. Big goblins, great ugly-looking goblins, lots of goblins, before you could say rocks and blocks. There were 6 to each dwarf at least, and 2 even for Bilbo, and they were all grabbed and carried through the crack before you could say tinder and flint. But not Gandalf. Bilbo's yell had done that much good. It had wakened him up wide in a splintered second, and when the goblins came to grab him, there was a terrific flash like lightning in the cave, a smell like gunpowder, and several of them fell dead. The crack closed with a snap, and Bilbo and the dwarves were on the wrong side of it. Where was Gandalf? Oh, neither they nor the goblins had any idea, and the goblins did not wait to find out. They seized Bilbo up and the dwarves and hurried them along. It was a deep dark such as only goblins that have taken to living in the heart of the mountains can see through. The passages were crossed and tangled in all directions, but the goblins knew their way as well as you do down to the nearest post office, and the way went down, and it was most horribly stuffy. The goblins were very rough and pinched unmercifully, and chuckled and laughed in the horror stony voices. And Bilbo was more happy even then than when the troll had picked him up by his toes. He wished again and again for his nice bright hobbit hole, not for the last time. Now there came a glimmer of red light before them. The goblins began to sing or croak, keeping time with the flap of their feet on the stone and shaking their prisoners as well. Clap, snack, the black crack, grip, crack, pinch, snap, and down go to Goblin Town you go, my lad. Crish, crash, crush, smash, hammering tongs and knockering gongs, pound, pound far underground, oh, oh, my lad. Swish, smack, whip and crack, batter and beat and yammer and bleat. Work, work, not dare to shriek, while goblins quaff and goblins laugh, round and round far underground below, my lad. It sounded truly terrifying. The walls echoed to the clap, snap, and crush and smash, and the ugly laughter of their ho, ho, my lad. The general meaning of the song was only too plain, for now the goblins took out whips and whipped them with a squish, smack, and set them running as fast as they could in front of them, and more than one of the dwarves were already yammering and bleeding like anything when they stumbled into a big cavern. It was lit by a great red fire in the middle, and the torches along the walls. It was full of goblins. They all laughed stamped and clapped their hands when the dwarves, with poor little Bilbo at the back, nearest to the whips, came running in, while the goblin drivers whooped and cracked their whips behind. The ponies were already there, huddled in a corner, and there were all bagels and packages lying broken and open and being rummaged by goblins and smelt by goblins and fingered by goblins and quarreled over by goblins. I'm afraid that was the last time they ever saw those excellent little ponies, including a jolly, sturdy little white fellow that Elrond had lent to Gandalf, since his horse was not suitable for the mountain paths. For goblins eat horses and ponies and donkeys and much more dreadful things, as they were always hungry. Just now, however, the prisoners were thinking only of themselves. The goblins changed their hands behind their backs and linked them all together in a line and dragged them to the far end of the cavern, with little Bilbo tugging at the end of the row. There in the shadows, on a large flat stone, sat a tremendous goblin with a huge head, and armed goblins were standing around him carrying axes and bent swords that they use. Now, goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well, but the most skilled dwarves, when they did take the trouble, though they're usually untidy and dirty, hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and all other instruments of torture, they make pretty well. Or they get other people to make their own design, prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invent some of the machines and have since troubled the world, especially ingenious devices for killing large number of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help, but in those days, those wild parts that they had not advanced, as if it was called, so far. They did not hate dwarves, especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the order and prosperous. In some parts, wicked dwarves even made alliances with them. They did have a special grudge against Thorin's people because of the war which you've heard mentioned, but which does not come into this tale. And anyway, goblins don't care who they catch, as long as it's done smart and secret and the prisoners are not able to defend themselves. "Who are these miserable persons?" said the great goblin. "Dwarves and this," said one of the drivers, pulling Bilbo's chain so that he fell forward onto his knees. "We found them sheltering on our front porch." "What do you mean by it?" said the great goblin, turning to Thorin. "Up to no good, I'll warrant. Spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I should be surprised to learn. Murderers and friend of elves, not unlikely. Come, what have you got to say?" "Thorin the dwarf at your service," he replied. It was merely as polite nothing. "Of all the things which you suspect and imagine, we have no idea at all. We sheltered from a storm in what seemed to be a convenient cave and unused. Nothing was further from our thoughts than inconveniencing goblins in any way whatsoever. That was true enough." Said the great goblin. "So you say? Might I ask what you're doing up in the mountains at all, and where you're coming from, and where you're going to? In fact, I should like to know all about you. Not that it will do you much good, Thorin Oakenshield. I know too much about your folk already. But let's have the truth, or I will prepare something particularly uncomfortable for you." "We were on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews and nieces, and first, second, third cousins, and the other descendants of our grandfathers, who live on the east side of the truly hospitable mountains," said Thorin, not quite knowing what to say at any once in any moment, when obviously the exact truth would not do at all. "He's a liar, a truly tremendous one," said one of the drivers. "Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave. We were invited these creatures to come below, and they are as dead as stones. Also, he has not explained this." He held out his sword, which Thorin had worn, and the sword which came from the troll's lair. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and all of his soldiers gnashed his teeth and clashed their shields and stamped. They knew the sword. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time. When the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills, or did battle before their walls, they had called it the Orcrist, goblin cleaver, but the goblins called it simply bitter. They hated it, and hated worse anyone that carried it. "Murderers and elf friends," the great goblin shouted. "Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnaw them, take them away to dark holes filled with snakes, and never let them jump and see the light of again." He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat and himself rushed at Thorin with his mouth open. Just at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out, and the great fire went poof in a tower of blue glowing smoke right up to the mouth, the scattering piece-white sparks all amongst the goblins. The yells and yammering, croaking, gibbering, and jabbering, howls, growling, cursing, shrieking, shirking that followed were beyond description. Several hundred wild cats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would have not been compared with it. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell from the roof made the air too thick for even their eyes to see through it. Soon they were falling over one and another, rolling in heaps on the floor, biting and kicking and fighting as if they had all gone mad. Suddenly, a sword flashed in its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin, as he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage. He fell, dead, and the goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. The sword went back into its sheath. "Follow me quick," said a voice, fierce and quiet, and before Bilbo understood what had happened, he was trotting along again as fast as he could trot, and at the end of the line, down more dark passages, the yell of the goblin howl growing fainter behind him. A pale light was leading them on. "Quicker! Quicker!" said the voice. "The torches will soon be lit." "Half a minute," said Dory, who was at the back next to Bilbo, and a decent fellow. He made the Hobbit scramble on his shoulders as best he could with his tied hands, and they all went at a run with a clinky clink of chains, a many stumble since they had no hands to steady themselves with. Not for a long while did they stop, and by that time they'd just have been right down the very mountain's heart. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf, but just then they were too busy to ask how they got there. He took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with a rage that made it gleam as if goblins were about. Now it was as bright as a blue flame for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatsoever of cutting through the goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. This sword's name was Glambring the Fellhammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it Beater, and hated it worse than bitter if possible. Orcus, too, has been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it up from one of the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, and though he could not do everything, he could do a great deal for a friend in a tight corner. "Are we all here?" Handing the sword back to Thorin with the bow. "Let me see. 1, 2, that's Thorin. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where are Fiji and Killy? Here they are, 12, 13. And here, Mr. Baggins, 14. Well, it must be worse. And then again, it might be a good deal better. No ponies, no food, and no knowing quite where we are, and hordes of angry goblins just behind. On we go. And on they went. Gandalf was quite right. They began to hear goblin noises and horrible cries far beyond in the passages that they have come through. They sent them on faster than ever, as poor Bilbo could not possibly go half as fast, for dwarves can roll along at a tremendous pace, I could tell you, when they have to, but they took it in turn to carry him on their backs. Still, goblins go faster than dwarves, and these goblins knew way better. They did make the path themselves, and they were madly angry. So do that what they could. The dwarves heard the cries and howls getting closer and closer. Soon they could hear even the flap of the goblin feet, many, many feet, which seemed only just round the last corner. The blinks of red torches could be seen behind them in the tunnel they were following. They were getting deadly tired. "Why, oh, why did I ever leave my hobbit hole?" said poor Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Mombur's back. "Why, oh, why did I ever bring a wretched little habit on a treasure hunt?" said Bombur. He was fat and staggered along with sweat dripping down his nose in the heat and the terror. At this point, Gandalf fell behind, and Thorin with him. They turned a sharp corner. "About turn!" he shouted. "Draw your sword, Thorin!" There was nothing else to be done, and the goblins did not like it. They came scurrying around the corner in a full cry, and found goblin cleaver and foe hammer shining cold, bright right in their astonishing eyes. The ones in front dropped their torches and gave one yell before they were killed. The ones behind yelled still more, and leaped back, knocking over those that were running after them. "Bitter and beater!" they shrieked. And as soon they were all in confusion, most of them were hustling back the way they came. It was quite a long while before any of them dared to turn that corner, but that time the dwarves have gone on in a long, long way to the dark tunnels of the goblins' realm. When the goblins discovered that, they pulled out their torches, and they slipped on soft shoes, and they chose out their very quickest runners with the sharpest ears and eyes. These ran fast and forward and swift as weasels in the dark, and with hardly any more noises than bats. That is why neither Bilbo, nor the dwarves, nor even Gandalf heard their coming, nor did they see them. But they were seen by the goblins that ran silently up behind, for Gandalf was letting his wand give out a faint light to help the dwarves as they went along. Quite suddenly, Dory, now at the back, again carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind the dark. He shouted and fell, and the hobbits rolled off his shoulders into the blackness, bumped his head on a hard rock, and remembered nothing more. And that was Chapter 4 of The Hobbit, read by me, Kriswixx. I'll be reading more chapters later in the week, so stay tuned. Thanks.